Chronic countryside, life in the face of colliding epidemics. It's 2019, and South Africa's Citizen newspaper carries a front-page article declaring it the sickest nation on the planet. 25 years into democracy, the country had come dead last in a global health survey. How could this be? Thanks to what is now the world's biggest HIV treatment program, our AIDS deaths have plummeted. Life expectancy is in fact higher than it was in 1994. There is also broad consensus that living standards have improved with wider access to clean water, sanitation, housing, and electricity than previously. And yet, South Africans find themselves deeply unwell. The Global Health Survey, in which we had fared so poorly, calculated wellness using 10 indices: blood pressure and blood sugar levels, rates of exercise, alcohol consumption, tobacco use, depression, obesity, and overall life expectancy. One might say it measured threats to a country's health, threats that are particularly associated with a category of illnesses termed non-communicable diseases, or NCDs. These conditions are long-term and degenerative. For the past decade, they have been the biggest contributors to South Africa's disease burden, both in terms of premature deaths and years of disability. At the time of the Citizen newspaper report, few would have anticipated a new pandemic on the horizon. COVID-19 has deepened the vulnerability of those with chronic long-term illness. Ours is a nation where epidemics collide. I'd learned that a few years before while researching HIV in Makanda. I sat one evening with a grandmother whose family had experienced 3 generations of long-term illness. She was living with hypertension and her grandson with HIV. Her daughter had died of AIDS and her brother was diabetic. She said, "People are tired of being sick. They're tired of taking medication. And the illnesses keep on spreading. HIV and high blood pressure, they're all the same. You take medication, but you're never cured." Within this story of sickness, I think, is another deeper story about unmet expectations. Expectations held about the pace and nature of change. Despite the gains that have been made, most South Africans had much higher hopes for what democracy and inclusion in global modernity would bring. The story of sickness in South Africa is, in many ways, about how the cumulative effects of our past and the profound uncertainties of our future land themselves on the body. As a health anthropologist, I wanted to write South Africa's rising and complex chronic illness burden as a type of social barometer. My project began with this image. The 2015-2016 District Health Barometer published a graph showing the districts with the highest rates of hypertension. As a leading risk factor for NCD deaths, a contributor to heart disease, and a close friend of diabetes, high blood pressure deserved attention in our attempts to make sense of the rising burden of chronic illness. I was surprised to discover that half of the country's top 10 most hypertensive districts overlaid the Karoo. And since the figures were age standardized, this had nothing to do with their populations being elderly. In the years between the publication of this graph and the writing of my book, rates of hypertension would decline. Researchers attributed this to improved access to treatment. But the most hypertensive districts remain in the arid, farmland, and rural parts of the country. The Karoo is central to this story. Looking at how NCDs are unfolding in South Africa unsettles a foundational assumption in the health literature, namely that these illnesses were reserved to big cities. I wanted to tell a different story, a story of disenchantment and dis-ease in the countryside. In the small Karoo town where I've set up base, every day is a confrontation with the mountain. This is not a mountain gently calling your eyes to the horizon, with valleys waiting to cradle you. Instead, the mountain is always at your chest, or your back, hovering over your head or swimming in your throat. On one of the mountain's lower peaks stands a tall crucifix, growing larger as you draw closer to the edges of town. Congregations gather at the foot of the cross to pray for rain. On nearby farms I'd seen wastelands where dams once were. All around the region, farmers dug deeper holes and deeper debt. The pills that flow over the pharmacy counter are for bloeddruk, suiker, respiratory conditions and chronic pain. While they may not be technically communicable, the escalated awareness and diagnosis of these conditions is often felt like a similar contagion. Most people are taking 3 or 4 chronic medicines at once, with the town's health workers desperately trying to support adherence, manage drug interactions, and cope with stockouts. In the public clinics, I quickly learned the names of tramadol for pain relief and triptyline, an antidepressant, adding to the assortment of pills swallowed daily. When you ask people about sickness here, some will say it's the water, others say it's the food. There is talk of the dust in the air and the cold in the mountain, the slow nights of fast drinking and the families shook by grief. Labourers work 12-hour shifts sharing bread and coke at lunchtime. Businesses offering cash loans or funeral services outnumber grocers. Here, descendants of the Khoisan, the Trakboers, British settlers and Kobas Amaxhosa live together in embattled yet deeply intimate relationship. This is a place of sickness, but also of care, where nurses deliver soup to clinic queues, where recipes for offal with apricots are slow-cooked and shared on weekends, where prayers are raised for the sick and the elderly, where clinicians are also mystics, where town gossip lays bare each one's physical, emotional, and historical wounds, ready for salt and soothing. The book that I'm writing is a story about how the recent social history of the Eastern Cape Karoo has worked its way into people's bodies. Of course, much of the story is left out of this presentation. Here I can only give snapshots from the book, which I've chosen to organize around one of its central threads, the story of food. Images of rural hideaways and farm-to-table cooking, pristine desolate plains and slow living are central to tourists' imagination of the Karoo. And yet, while Potsdal sell boutique preserves and top-quality biltong, showing off the best of Karoo food, some in these areas live in nutritional deserts, kilometers from anywhere fresh food is sold, let alone grown. During my field research, the Eastern Cape was in the midst of a crippling drought. Some said the worst they'd seen in their lifetimes. While drought was nothing new here, the vast plains were also marked by something much more contemporary: rubbish. On windy days, plastic is flung up against farm fences. Empty cans shoot through the air like bullets. At dump sites, strips of plastic and discarded animal fat are set alight by desert heat, sending thick smoke into azure blue. Litter rushes along the sidewalks, laying bare a host of meals. Women hired as street cleaners bend to pick it up, their long skirts splaying and fluttering like flags. Among the trash heaps are used blister packs of diabetes medication. Both food and medicine, once routinely harvested from the land, are now packaged and sold, each leaving their own debris. Litter had not existed on this scale before, not until the arrival of Big Food, which happened to coincide with the democratic transition, new government, and the growing rule of the market. Food, I'd soon learn, is produced and consumed within a longer social history, such that what passes through our mouths also signals the aspirations and constraints of the time. Farms that had once been largely self-sufficient, growing vegetables and wheat alongside the rearing of livestock and living off their produce, were now reorienting themselves. It's no longer a lifestyle, one farmer's wife told me. It's a business. Many farms had been reduced to livestock ranches where little or nothing was grown that did not translate to profits. Permanent workforces had shrunk as increasing numbers of owners opted for contract labor. Some converted their land to game lodges where labor needs were smaller and more specialized. In the crossfire, farm dwellers are displaced into the region's small towns. The close-knit, characteristically feudal and at times brutal relationships between owners and workers come undone. And payment for farm workers shifts from rations of produce and limited wages to a purely cash-based system grounded in minimum wage. All these shifts are far more complex than what can be captured now. They have been propelled by a range of political and economic forces and exacerbated by deepening drought. But the consequences for food systems, as well as people's relationships to the land, have been marked. Cash-based remuneration has brought new freedoms, giving farm dwellers greater control over their diet and earnings. But wages don't stretch very far in town, and shopping is often restricted to a monthly affair. This has meant a growing preference for food that can be stretched, both across time and mouths. For many, food no longer comes directly from the earth, a delicate mixing of land and labor. Instead, it is produced, packaged, and sold by companies. Now more than ever, food produces trash, plastic, tin, and polystyrene, and shopping lists are increasingly populated by brand names. This is the scene in which non-communicable diseases enter, and they too are read as signs of their times. Illness becomes a prism to understand how change has landed on us. In early 2019, I sat with a 6-year-old farm labourer in Kiplot as he remarked on the emergence of NCDs among his cohort. "You know," he said, "these diseases like diabetes, we never used to have them before among our workers." When I asked what he believed had changed, his response was both pointed and indirect. "The chicken I buy in the store," he said, "tastes different to the chicken I kill on the farm." I'm going to pause for a moment to talk about cancer, because despite being among the most prevalent NCDs, it sits very separately in the public imagination. While diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, and respiratory conditions are often explained away by lifestyle, cancer carries a far greater sense of mystery, foreboding, fatalism. When discussing other NCDs like hypertension or diabetes, linkages to food and land might seem natural, but with cancer, they're often less expected, which is why I was surprised by my first conversation with Abram Jeffries. Abram is a gospel singer living in Kroonvale, a township on the outskirts of Graaff-Reinet. At the time, one of Abram's colleagues was again battling prostate cancer, having been in remission for years. His friend, a teacher, had received a cancer diagnosis but remained too fearful to join a support group, and Abram's grandmother had recently died of cancer. Only a few months after this meeting, his teenage niece would also succumb to the disease. To reach Abram's house, I had to navigate winding roads climbing up towards a koppie. As I ascended the hill, tar roads turned to uneven gravel, and the earth became dry and solid. "There's just so much cancer," Abram said, hanging his head. I'd heard it before. Nearly everyone I met during my fieldwork had been touched by cancer in some way. It was the talk of clinic waiting rooms, shopping aisles, and pharmacy queues, and the cause for local fundraisers and awareness campaigns. Doctors and nurses described a swell of cancer cases passing through their wards: cancer of the prostate, lungs, stomach, throat, cervix, breast, and so the list went on. "We didn't used to see all this cancer," Abram said. "People have gotten sicker. Maybe the last 40 years or so. People never used to die of these things. We don't know why it's happening." "Why do you think it's happening?" I asked. "People talk so much nowadays about chemicals in food," he said, "how unsafe the water is. Last week I took a woman and child to the hospital because of the water. It was brown with a horrible smell. I don't understand why we're being fed food that's killing us. We know Coke is unhealthy, so why is it sold everywhere? When we grew up, our parents were gardeners. They would bring back vegetables from the gardens or sell those vegetables in town. We grew things at our houses. But now the land is dried up. You have to add fertilizer and put in so much work. And then there are the municipal water restrictions. So people pull out everything, even the grass." Not even cancer, it seemed, could escape this logic. That illness was a symptom of an ancient pact gone sour. And that pact was between people and their land. In all the health facilities I observed, non-communicable diseases were primarily understood as dietary conditions, putting dietitians on the front lines of day-to-day primary health care. Dietitians were sent the underweight and the overweight, breastfeeding mothers and malnourished children, those whose blood was too forceful, too fatty, or too sweet, and in the worst cases, those unable to bite or chew or swallow. Given all I'd learnt about the widening rift between people's plates and the land, I wanted to know what it meant, in a setting like this, to try and use food as medicine. So I arranged to shadow Paula, a dietitian posted at a regional hospital. Much of Paula's work is with newly diagnosed diabetics, those suffering high cholesterol, high blood pressure, kidney and heart problems. But her morning rounds begin in the general ward. That's where you'll see late-stage AIDS and other complications, she told me. There's a lot of wasting. Usually I'm distributing supplements for weight gain, but then when patients go home and aren't eating hospital food, it's difficult. So I'll give them tips like adding a bit of margarine to their pup. Because it's fortified, I asked. That, and to get the extra fat. Isn't it ironic, I said, that you're trying to encourage weight gain among one set of patients and weight loss in another? The Rama is prescribed and then derided. And the thing is, Paula added, I know that HIV-positive patients are susceptible to cardiac conditions because of their medication, but they also need to gain weight. In treating AIDS-related wasting, Paula was also reconciling a concurrent threat, heart disease. What Paula was seeing in her everyday work was a collision of both infectious and non-infectious epidemics, both underweight and overweight, sometimes in the same wards, the same families, even the same patients. In all of Paula's consultations, there comes a point in which the patient must step up to be weighed. It seemed to me that dietitians were also involved in a delicate balancing of scales, in which there could not be too much sugar, salt, or cholesterol, or too little fat, nutrients, or minerals. Involved in these calibrations are gambles and concessions, and often limited room to maneuver. Later that day, Paula and I sat opposite a mother and child in a local clinic. How often do you eat meat? Paula asks. Fresh Karoo meat was widely celebrated throughout the country. Well-known physician and dietary evangelist Tim Noakes had even advocated it to mend the health of the region's farm workers. But in my observations with dietitians, I learned that the idea of quality meat on the menu was a stretch for most. Once a week, the mother replied. Usually on Sundays we have chicken. Okay, Paula nodded with encouragement. And do you eat beans? Yeah, if there are, the mother responds. This, if there are, encourages Paula to probe further. How often do you eat vegetables? First of the month, if there are, the mother says. But they're gone in 1 or 2 weeks. For millions of South Africans, nourishment has monthly rhythms, attached to payday. Month-end is a time of long lines at cash machines and in the grocery aisles, of stocking up and paying back debt, of trips to town and treats for children. Relative to non-perishable and processed foods, vegetables stand the least chance of making it to the next cycle. This month, the mother explained, I didn't have any money because I bought clothes. Paula nodded and sat quietly for a while, looking at the baby resting on his mother's lap. What about chips and sweeties? She asked. I give him 1 round chips maybe twice each week, the soft ones. I don't like the 50-cent ones. I thought that may be giving him the rash. Couched in this talk about chips were also a series of assertions about care. The relationship between food and care is part of why the subject is so riddled with potential shame. Does giving my kids chips make me a bad mother? Does not giving them chips make me a bad mother? If I don't serve what's expected, how will this reflect on my ability to care? Can I refuse food that is shared with me on health grounds, and with what social consequences? It struck me how many of the clinic consultations I observed were caught up in these everyday economies of care, how to weigh up different care priorities, clothing, nourishment, social approval, within the limits of what one could afford. Within the tight constraints of their patients' lives, doctors and dietitians were trying desperately to give practicable prescriptions. It was not unlike cooking. Add a little bit of this, take away a little bit of that, make substitutions where necessary, always with a very limited set of ingredients. Back in the consultation room, the mother is standing up to leave. As she does, she says, I always do my best. You're doing very well, Paula reassures her, then turns to me and says, that was a very generalizable case. And it was. A case of a home without wages, of bargains and wagers, of millipap cooked 3 ways, of false choices, of mothers left out in the cold, still scorched by shame. The Karoo is cast as a place of healing, of Victorian sanatoriums, bossy doctors, and fresh, clean air. But for as long as I can tell, that mythology has come at a price, and I mean that both in the literal and the metaphorical sense. I suppose what I'm suggesting is not that the possibility for healing is done for, but rather that this healing means attending to the severances between ourselves, others, and the land.